I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark, What If?
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to Arcane Mark's What If 5 Ideas That Aren't in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So basically today we are going to be talking about 5 different ideas that are not in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I'm positing what if. So are these all good ideas? Maybe not. Are these all my ideas? No, these are just like ideas that just were posited at some point in time. They're from all different people. Some of them are in the playtest, and you might actually know who came up with them when we talked about it in the playtest. Some of them were not in the playtest. And this is not like the list of the things that Mark thinks should have been in the game at all, because some of them have significant drawbacks. This is here. Wouldn't it be interesting? What if this thing was in the game? Here are the ramifications. There's at least one of these that just like absolutely wouldn't work, and you can decide which one that is. The others are like, this might work, but you'd have to. You lose some significant things. You might gain some other things. There's one that was just like, no, this just wouldn't work at all. But we're going to talk about the what if for all of them, because sometimes the what if is everybody's zombies, right? So we'll start with number 5. What if Pathfinder 2nd Edition had 6 saving throws, and it added a might save, and it added a soul save and a wits save, where soul was wisdom, wits was intelligence, and will was charisma. Might, of course, being strength. But so what if it had 6 saving throws? So this is an idea that was super early in a design doc, just sitting there as like a question mark, and then it's like, it was one that I put in. I was like, this could be cool because all of the ability scores would be used. And then there were a lot of other drawbacks that came up at the time. We kind of were probably not going to do it anyway. And then shortly thereafter, it's like, oh, 5e is doing that. And so they said, all right, let's not do that. So
would the might save have picked up some of the things that are athletics territory?
It would have picked up some of the things that are like using fort saves, even though your strength probably matters a lot more than your constitution, like gust of wind blowing you away and certain other things. And it also could have been a defense for some of the athletic maneuvers that fortitude is a defense for. And so the will save would have been specifically like mental, taking control of your mind effects. Some of the things that are currently in will might have wound up like in the soul save, like curses. Some of the things that are in fortitude, a few of them that are like things that like trap your soul or mess things up like that, or like that are spirit, could have wound up in that one. And then some of the effects that wound up using like perception checks to give you something that they would be able to do, or like maze, how it wound up having like survival in there, or I think
that would be
a perception.
Those
could be the wits. One, right? Those could be wits. So it would not necessarily have been an equal split between all of them, but just having saves that were related to all of them would have been able to.
What kind of stuff would have gone into the charisma one?
That would have been pure, like, something's, like, taking control of you. So,
that makes sense.
Like,
it's dominate, like a contest
charm,
of wills.
But also, just a lot of the things that are based on just your willpower and just how, like, how strong your will and personality are, could have been in that one. And, yeah, so that there are some drawbacks there. So one of them is that they wouldn't have been balanced between the 6 of them. One that you could say is a pro or a con is that all of the ability scores would have wound up having a saving throw associated with them. Now, I consider this to be mainly a pro because it means that every time you make a decision about your character's stats, it's going to help something that is necessarily rolled and that the game might assume that you have. Whereas otherwise, like charisma, it's got some good stuff in the final game, but you also, if you don't want to use that good stuff, you may just be able to avoid using it and avoid any kind of drawback for having that 8 charisma in most circumstances.
You would see, I imagine, like more critical failures and things like that coming up, though, because people wouldn't be able to invest in all of them. So every character is going to have some weaknesses where they're going to be getting hit by that. But that would also be true
probably
about
you might lower some of the DCs a little, and that would be true for monsters.
Yeah, I was about to say that would be true for monsters too, where you would have like a broader sense of things. I imagine that'd be something that people would definitely want to. Well, already you might want to. Try to figure out some stuff with recall knowledge to see if you can figure out how best to target your foes. But
right.
There would be
at that point,
broader spectrum
foes would probably have an elite and a terrible save.
Yes.
They might have like 1 elite, 1 high, 2 average, 1 low, and 1 terrible. So you'd be like, oh well, the Lich's wits is their elite. Let's not target that.
Yes.
And their will is also pretty high, and and is their soul, but their might is terrible.
Yes.
So we can gust of wind and blow that lich away.
So you would then like as a spellcaster want to pick up a wide variety of different spells that would target against a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. And spellcasters would therefore become a little bit more powerful because if they had the knowledge or the ability to guess, they would be able to, well, first of all, if we said that maybe they had 1 elite, 1 high, 2 average, 1 low, 1 terrible on average, there would be at least 2 out of 6, which is 1/3, which is the same chance as you currently have, that would be low or below.
Yeah.
One of them would be below. So even if you picked at random, your chance of getting a low or below save has gone up. And your chance of getting a terrible save has gone up from probably 0 on a lot of monsters to 1 out of 6. So it would be a stealth buff for spellcasters. You're right, Linda. And so one of the issues, though, and on the flip side, is it does mean that everything gets involved. If you don't like that, then that could have been a problem too. So I think that's mostly what the consequences are for doing this. It definitely means that characters are more likely to spend their ability boost to try to get up some of those other ability scores. So you might still try to get a 24 in your main ability score and min-max it, but instead of trying to get a 20 in the second ability score, you might stick with an 18 and get 2 other stat boosts into something else to put up its saving throw. And so that is kind of our what if scenario about that one. So shall we move to number 4?
Yes.
All right, so number 5 was not in anything. Number 4 was in the playtest. What if proficiencies were 1 off from each other instead of 2 off from each other? So in the playtest, if you're trained, you had a +0. If you're expert, +1, master +2, and legendary was +3. Incidentally, untrained was -2, but you still added your level. We'll talk about that as a separate toggle in this same one, but first let's ignore whether or not we use the untrained part and just talk about what if proficiency was +1. So we would have some of the effects that exist in the playtest. So first of all, the drawback. To a lot of people, if you're playing a D100 system where +1 is +5, it's like adds 5%. People are like, oh wow, we got 5 more. But in a D20 system, hearing about 1 just sounds bad. It's not bad, but it sounds bad. It feels not as good to get a 1. Even though, like, in any computer game that you could think of, something that is the equivalent of +1 AC in any Pathfinder or D&D or D20 game, aka this is a 5% chance to avoid all damage from when people attack you. that is cumulative additively, whereas in video games it's usually like multiplicatively cumulative and gets worse and worse and sort of scales out. So like it's cumulative additively, so it gets better and better as you keep taking this 5% dodge chance. That would be a must take every time in a computer game. But a +1 doesn't feel as good. So one of the big drawbacks is that it would feel like it doesn't matter as much compared to other modifiers, even though it's still pretty hefty. But now on the flip side of that, it allows for a lot of very interesting things to go on that are a little bit of can be a little bit of a proud nail with +2 proficiency. So for example, with +2 proficiency, 2 is just so enormous, especially in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that it kind of required, as soon as it became +2, that like, okay, so fighters are legendary with weapons. All other martials ever that are like a full martial character, not like I'm a utility caster, had to get to master at that point. And not only that, they even had to get to master at armor, all of them too. And champions and monks are legendary in armor. And even on your weakest save, you had to get to expert in that. And that added a bunch of required features that are just like, okay, so like this character that's not even thought of as having like the highest fortitude is got great fortitude, I guess. So the reason for this is just that being behind by 2 is already bad. Being behind by 4 is just too much. Yeah. It's so much that it is the difference between like a fighter, which is better than everyone else at weapons, and like a wizard now is 4, because that's more than what the difference between legendary and trained was in the playtest.
Yeah. Well, you can think about it sort of like, when I think of 4, I think about sort of roll twice and take the higher, right? Because you've got an expected value around the same. Because it would be like, imagine that the wizard and the fighter have the same attack bonus, but the fighter gets to roll twice and take the higher every time they attack.
Yep.
It's not obviously exactly the same, but
it's kind of similar.
It's kind of
because
similar.
Of the way that crits work. It's similar enough at a lot of different points in the curve. It's not exactly the same, but you know, it comes out to a somewhat similar math.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. In the playtest, for example, the idea was like, you know, barbarians, they only got up to expert in weapons. They actually just didn't learn as much about their weapons as some of the other martial classes, like in terms of like training and doing like elegant techniques that people taught them of like, yes, you put the rapier in exactly this way, but they just did a ton of damage. And that only put them, you know, 1 behind on accuracy from those other martial classes, 2 behind the fighter. That's the same as they are now at master. But the other interesting thing about it is, it gave, because it was only 1 away, it gave space for some interesting situations. So, for example, if you had a cloistered cleric who was only ever trained in weapons, well, that's okay. They were only 2 behind the martial characters in their accuracy other than fighter. That's already what spellcasters are in the final game. But you could also potentially have a war priest that was expert in weapons, and that'd be okay. It'd be 1 behind the martial characters, be 1 ahead of the cleric, of the cloistered cleric. So you actually wind up, because of the gap becomes so far that there can't be as much of a distance apart when they're all 2 apart. It kind of removes the ability to do an interstitial or intermediate amount of proficiency in certain cases. It also means that the like weapon and armor proficiency feats that give you trained used to be quite good, because of the fact that like not everybody even got master in armor. Even among the martial classes, expert is the max that a lot of them went to. And so being trained in full plate for a low dex character is certainly going to be good, even if your class could have gotten expert in light armor if you're not a high dexterity character. Plus, there were ways to get up to expert if you, and there still are, if you tried hard enough. So that actually made a fairly significant difference for some of the sort of hybrid-ish castery / alchemist classes, because basically what happened is that the super completely casters got pulled up to them, up to their level on a mercy pull because of the fact that it was already so low, and their level was even a little bit lower than it was before because everything was apart by 2.
So did that also influence when you are looking at the design space? One of the things I've seen people talking about in the chat of how many things are going to be tied to proficiency to access or unlock, knowing that the classes were going to be similar to each other in that way.
It does, and also it requires. So let's get to the other half of this, which required some other interesting design changes. Which is, let's talk about the other half, which is level -2 for untrained instead of untrained is just nothing. So in general, the drawback of level -2 for untrained is like almost 100% in athletics, which may have suggested that athletics should have been something other than a skill or somehow different because people thought of it differently. Is like 90% of examples, because of the fact that like you still have to be trained to know certain amounts of knowledge that you only know like kind of basic stuff you learned on the road if you're not trained in the playtest. The main example of a problem is I just want my wizard to be bad at strength. I don't want them to be able to climb a rope. Like, it's not that easy to climb a rope in PE class or swim, especially if you're a wizard with really low strength, or make a giant leap. And at level 20, making a very large leap with the wizard doesn't make sense. So that's an issue with proficiency as level -2. And that's one that like probably would have had to require athletics to be somehow not a skill. Maybe it was like a special thing like perception, right? And that wizards could just not get it. Or something else that it's just like, yeah, you just don't have it unless you're trained in it. There are other ways around it. It's a little tricky. The benefit, though, was that with that one is that you used to be able to like put things up against like athletics or survival in the case of maze or acrobatics or any other skill in the game and have that be like the defensive DC of an ability. But you can't do that. And so therefore you almost can't create something like a create pit spell with a scaling DC to climb out of the pit, because since athletics doesn't go up, if the enemy spellcaster casts that and you're now in a pit and you didn't train in athletics or get some kind of thing that lets you add your level, that lets you basically remove the thing that we put in because of the playtest feedback, then you're never getting out of the pit. Because it's scaled in DC. It's DC 31. So it's tall enough that even that natural 20 that's a regular success, you don't get all the way up the pit, and then you fall immediately on your next attempt. Unless, I guess you'll get up if you can get 20 in a row multiple times. So you can't really defend against things with a skill because of that. That's sort of something that changed. So in a what-if machine, you might be able to defend against things with skills, and you might be able to have a little bit more nuance with like picking up the weird secondary things, like being a caster who also fights and has a different doctrine for it, like War Priest, or taking a proficiency from a general feat. But it also has significant drawbacks, like the visceral feel of what proficiency gives you in the final system is incredibly satisfying and powerful, and it's hard to like put those on a scale like in Egyptian mythology against a feather and see what's what. So that's why we're talking about what if and not about like this one's good or this one's bad. I'm gonna try not to make a value judgment on any of these what ifs. They obviously all didn't make it in, so they have significant drawbacks. All right, so next after that is going to be number 3. So number 3 was an idea from very early on that was, what if there was no such thing as class features other than spellcasting progression, and every single thing was a feat? Everything that was in the class other than spellcasting progression, and spellcasters get fewer feats because their spellcasting progression was in the feats.
So then you wouldn't have like.
But I mean, sorry, their spellcasting progression was not a feat.
Yeah.
So
you would. So this would be like, oh, you know, you have some basic spellcaster chassis that you can take, and otherwise you are a character that can be like, oh, you know, I want to take like some barbarian type stuff.
That you still had classes, but like all of your rage stuff was in the feats. You might have like one feature at first level that you get, like maybe rage. But, like, all the instinct progressions and, like, fighters, extra weapon, proficiency. So this has some serious drawbacks. One of them is it creates a huge number of feat taxes that everyone will obviously pick. We actually had a build that was like this at one point, and everybody obviously picked the one for fighter that gave them extra proficiency in their weapon every time. It has another drawback, which is that it makes it harder to, like, distinguish what the character of that class actually is or does if you don't have at least some shared baseline between characters of that class. Because this actually, I was thinking about Barbarian. There was no Barbarian Rage because there was no Barbarian. This was only with the Core 4 when this was ever even attempted. And it was like, yeah, what does a fighter or a rogue have? Well, nothing necessarily. You had to take sneak attack. You had to take like any of the things that you expected.
I imagine in a system like this you wouldn't have multi-class archetypes because so much of the customization would be available to everybody. Then you just have like these basic things that are like this class means this narrow scope of things, and then you could
still. It never existed at a point in time when archetypes also existed. Let's be clear, but we can what if about it.
Mm-hmm.
You might be able to, and you would decide what part of the feats you would allow. Maybe you would tag certain ones that you weren't going to allow from multi-class archetypes.
So I'm a little confused. Is this the case that would be like Rage is Barbarian, but then the instincts are feats that anyone can pick up because they're not associated with Barbarian?
Barbarian didn't exist at the time of this, so I'm going to guess that even Rage would be a feat that you have to take.
Oh, wow.
Everything was feats.
Yeah.
So another drawback of this is it makes building your character take a long time because you get a lot of feats. That is another drawback. Now, I want to give a benefit because I just gave a ton of drawbacks. A benefit is that your character is really flexible. And, that you can pick whatever you want. You're definitely only getting abilities you want. Now there's a drawback to that benefit, which is that abilities that are sort of like D&D might call ribbon abilities, or abilities that are just like, this really makes me feel more like this class in certain ways, but it absolutely isn't useful most of the time to have it. Those abilities will never get chosen by anyone. You can't give it to someone for free because there's no such thing as class features.
So I guess what you would probably need to do in a system like that is tie ribbons to power abilities.
Yes.
So you'd have certain ribbons that are the most thematically tied to that and be like, you get this and also this ribbon. But
that's right.
But like we've talked about definitely in the past on this show, when people see an ability that does like one thing and then also another small thing, they might be like, well, I don't like that other small thing, so
therefore,
if I'm not
I won't buy the whole
I'm not
thing.
going to buy the whole thing.
Because it must be bad. It's not worth it to me because I didn't want the small thing. It is absolutely true. In real life and in a feat. They'd be like, I must not be getting the full value of this feat.
Yeah.
Because that one bullet point of things that it gives me is something I will never use.
So you would need to find some way to kind of pull back the curtain on what you were doing there with the ribbon that would be like, you know, benefits like primary and secondary. And then people would compare secondary benefits to secondary, primary benefits to primary. But then, if you were going to do that, would you want to have, like, does everything have a ribbon, or just, like, some of them have ribbons?
Yeah, you'd have to think about that.
Or maybe ribbons were a separate category.
It messes up the idea of trying to have a high floor and making it easier for new players, as Joe Jungers mentioned, and Myriad Starflurry.
Sort of like how
because it's because of those feat taxes, not everyone knows about them, so it's a trap to build a fighter that doesn't have the extra accuracy.
Yeah.
So,
but like, would the ribbons then be a separate category, right? So you have like regular feats, and you have ribbon feats, and then you have skill feats, and then you have.
So, even back then, there was an idea that there might be different buckets, but this was just for the class feat bucket, which was being done separately from like the skill feat bucket and the ancestry buckets. So. And Rico says, why even have classes at that point? Yeah, that's a good question. So, I did tell you all at the beginning of the episode, not all of these, all of these didn't make it in, so they're all at least flawed in some way. And I said that at least one of them is just definitely not a good idea. You will have to decide which one that is. I said at least one. It might be this one. It sounds like chat thinks it's this one. So, there definitely was extremely interesting. It definitely has a wide variety of drawbacks in our what if, and it definitely had a lively chat. So I'm glad I brought that one up. Whether or not as overall it was an idea that was worth continuing, obviously we didn't. So next I'm going to bring up another one that was in the playtest. Number 2, resonance. Yes, resonance. Resonance was perhaps the least popular thing in the entire playtest, but it's one that I've seen even some of the people online who in the playtest were like, this is terrible, have come in later, and I actually really appreciate this because it's actually hard to change your mind on something, especially when you've gone public against it and been like, I was too hard on resonance. Now that I've played for a while, I've seen that it had some really good things that it did.
Alright, so what is resonance?
So, let's back up a little bit. There's a problem with consumable items when you're making them just collect them all and then consume them once. I'm not talking about like Estus Flask, Dark Souls style, use them and then when you go to rest, they all automatically replenish. That's kind of like a rest-based system prepared spells in a way. It's just like healing spells that look like an item because they're in a potion.
Yes.
I'm talking about actually consumed items. The Final Fantasy Mega Elixir problem. I'm a hoarder of those items. I will admit it. I'm admitting it to all of you right now. I never use them. I love them. I never use them unless I'm in a dire strait and I know that I have to. And I do. That's true in any game that I play.
That's for the really expensive, powerful ones. But then there's also the thing that the fundamental nature of an item of a consumable item transforms, because when you can first buy it and you're the first levels who could possibly buy it, it's like, wow, this is an expensive thing, and I want to be careful with it. But once you get to a bunch of levels higher, you can just be like, oh, I have this stockpile
like, oh,
of things.
I can buy a new item that I'm looking for at this level, or for 10% of the cost, I could buy 1,000 of this consumable item. Even then, I actually sometimes have trouble using it. I just have to convince myself that, like, I'll never run out just because it's hard to get over that point, or that it's such a good deal. But it actually causes huge issues in the game that when you have an evergreen style benefit item that you can spam out as much as you want at higher levels, because the cost is basically not a cost. Yes. So it goes from, oh, this is a significant cost, this is an interesting drawback, you have to pay that much of your current money to use this scroll, to a like, oh yeah, we can use this scroll every encounter. Yes. It doesn't cost anything. It is such a like, if we had to file this to the IRS in in-game world, they would say just don't even bother. It's not. Yeah. It's 0.001% of your return, and so at that point, it actually just causes issues, and it's pretty hard to get a balance between the two of those, because I'll tell you right now, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, when you buy an item that is the maximum consumable item that you're allowed to buy by the game, which I think in some ways, like, it's misleading to new players that we might have wanted to come up with some way, somehow, I don't know how, to make it so that, like, the item level was different. It would have been very inelegant, but when people see that they're level 5 and that there's a level 5 consumable item, they think that, like, that's an item. That's the one they're supposed to be definitely buying a lot of at that level, and it actually is like, this is the most powerful you can possibly get at that level, or crafts. And they're very expensive at that level. People are like, they're too expensive, some people say. But they're pretty strong for what they do. If you compare, like, a scroll to a wand typically costs, like, about 8 times as much as the scroll, and you can use it every day, so after 8 days it's paid for itself. So one can be a good long-term purchase, but a scroll is definitely a good contingency item even at that point. But people don't think about that because actually wands are not the same item level as a scroll of their spell.
Yeah.
They're actually a higher item level because consumable items essentially do a stronger thing at their level than a permanent item would do once per day, and so it makes it hard to tell. But when that very high cost that people are like, this is prohibitive, becomes a like, oh, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
That's a guarantee. So why did I get into this long spiel to explain what resonance is? Well, basically, if money is the only thing that determines whether you can use a consumable item, you will always have this problem in any game that uses a quadratic or above loot scale. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is roughly on an exponential curve because of the fact that it assumes that, like, beat 2 creatures that are 2 levels lower than you, that's about the same as 1 creature at your level in XP.
Yes.
For that reason and a variety of other reasons, money is roughly on that scale. It's not exactly. There's a very weird and interesting curve. But it's at least measured on an exponential scale. That means that this is guaranteed to happen if it's above linear. And since it does happen, how do you stop it? If you want to stop it. How do you stop the fact that just like a party that has like 500 of this little consumable that buying 500 is nothing to them, is getting this benefit that is large and that takes a lot of people's time buying the 500 items and using the 500 items, and the answer, or one answer, is come up with for the playtest is resonance, which limits the number of items that you can use and activate during each day. It also was attached to investment of items, or investiture of magic items, permanent magic items, but there was also a playtest, like, during the playtest later on, that was like, let's separate them out. And it was basically one of the least popular things in the entire playtest. And so, people were very unhappy about it. One of the main things is that one of the major things I learned from Pathfinder 2nd Edition is that no matter what you do with items, people will think that potions deserve to work differently than every other item in the game in, like, every possible way. Whether it's, like, whether it's about, like, how, like, if an animal can use them, whether it's about whether they cost resonance, whether it's about anything else. So it was very problematic for a lot of people, especially with potions, but even with anything else, that they had to eventually stop using their items for the day at a certain point.
Wasn't the example sort of like, well, if I'm dying and I've already had too many of these and I can't drink a healing potion, that doesn't make sense? Wasn't that one of the ones you were talking about?
It was always the healing potion.
Yeah.
A lot of the time. But people still weren't happy about it, even if they didn't bring up the healing potion. And when I say that, it wasn't universally disliked. Even when we did the later resonance test, like, we mentioned to people in a stream afterwards that a decent number of people liked the new version. A decent number, not a lot, but like some percent, like the old version of resonance. But it was mixed. There was no really strong amount that was more than like a small percentage that were like liked any proposed variant, or just was like, get rid of it entirely, and that suggested that needed to not be in, because there was nothing that anybody actually liked in terms of resonance. Unfortunately, what it means is that there is known to kind of just be essentially no limit on using lower level consumables, so it also requires a look at consumables in terms of, like, let's try to mitigate the damage that can be done from these evergreen consumables that are super powerful even at very, very high levels, and that you can buy at low levels.
So then that means that
and you still can't.
So when you're looking at low level consumables, though, you want to make sure that you don't have like super powerful effects that are accessible in those low level items.
That's right. And people here are talking about the Estus Flask style, like, it's basically kind of a spell that you get at the beginning of each day, or after resting or something like that, resting at the campfire in Dark Souls. So for people who don't know what that is, in the Dark Souls games, when you rest at a campfire, all of your potions come back to the maximum that you can have. You can use them to heal. They are essentially healing spells that look like a potion. It's great. it works well for me with my Mega Elixir problem. I absolutely use them. But that's sort of not the feel in most like tabletop RPGs of going around collecting a scroll from somewhere that necessarily works. Resonance was a very interesting idea, and Dalvin points out it changed the game world since in some of the stories before you never had a you could just spam like 1,000 scrolls if you had 1,000 scrolls and you'd be fine. So any story that you told about using massive number of consumable items in a row, or like a character who just like was covered in 80 wands and all they did was use wands, like you could have that as an NPC, like a really rich aristocrat with used magic device in Pathfinder 1 who was just constantly using magic items and had no actual abilities but money and a lot of items. You can't really tell that story if you have resonance. So it certainly has issues. Philip Ben says it was tragically flawed. Yes, it was a tragic hero. It had too much hubris, but it had a lot of potential because it would have solved a serious problem that also required tamping down on some things and still not solving it. Like, there's already still people who are talking about certain consumable spam at high levels being one of the major factors. And I actually consider this still good, which is high level play is hard to get like even remotely close to balanced in a tabletop RPG. It's just difficult because things pile up as you get to higher levels. Not because it's a high number, but just because you get so many things that eventually, if everything's a little bit stronger or weaker than you expected, you get a lot stronger or weaker over the sum. People saying that like it almost was balanced except for these consumables actually makes me feel good that it almost was balanced, and that you could just make your own resonance rule maybe and make it a little bit make it fine. So it's a good thing that it's close to being balanced. It's not a great thing that low level consumables throws it off, because that's one of those things that experienced players or players who have a lot of time to devote to like buying all of these different consumables will like get a pretty huge advantage over a brand new player who just kind of wants to play, and they don't want to spend 2 hours buying 30 different scrolls.
The more that expertise comes into play, the more that, you know, the system has to design around the person who doesn't have that expertise, and so therefore the GM of somebody who's the GM of, you know, a group that does have that expertise is going to need to modify and adjust and make things more difficult to compensate.
Yep, absolutely. So that's resonance. That was number 2.
Not just for this. I mean, not just for resonance. I don't want to be like, oh yeah, it's because of resonance or whatever. But
no, resonance would have helped avoid that.
But it's one of the factors that builds onto sort of that expectation.
All right, so that's number 2. Are you ready? Everyone ready for idea number 1? And
yes.
These are not like in order of anything in particular. Number 1, glancing blows. So you may have noticed that there are critical successes, failures, and critical failures in Pathfinder 2nd Edition for most types of checks. One of the types of... they don't have to be, though. If you don't put a critical success entry, then you just use the regular success. If you don't put a critical failure entry, you just use the regular failure. It turns out if you don't put a failure entry at all, that means that failure means nothing happens. So that's just sort of... those are the defaults. Glancing blows was a very early on idea for strikes, where because it just doesn't feel great when you strike and then it doesn't do anything, right? And it just completely misses. And in a D20 system that is even like remotely fair, like I'm not talking about like times that your PF1 or 3.5 character had plus 72 to hit against a 21 AC. I'm talking about like ones where like you actually aren't sure about whether you're going to hit the monster because their AC is pretty reasonable. There's a lot of numbers on that die that do not hit, and that's not as fun. So the idea of glancing blows were that if you fail but do not critically fail with your attack roll, you do half of minimum damage.
And folks are discussing in chat that there are some feats that are out there.
There are. That's correct, Rico. Yes. In fact, after we got rid of that idea like pretty early in the alpha, and then made some feats that were based on it anyway. So with glancing blows where you do half of minimum. So it's not even remotely as good as the half damage on a spell, right? Because that's half of actual damage.
Mm-hmm.
Half of minimum from glancing blows was very interesting. It had some significant drawbacks. So one of them was that even early on, there was definitely worry that the critical success, failure, critical failure system might be hard to adjudicate in play and slow down the game. And strikes are a very common use of D20 roll. So that would mean that you had to actually pay more attention to your sort of Hail Mary strikes that you make at lower accuracy, because they're actually still pretty likely to get a glancing blow. It could have potentially slowed down the game by a lot. Now, it was early on enough that it wasn't completely tested whether it would do that or not. So we're not sure, but there was a pretty good sense that it would have slowed down the game a significant amount. And because it's a very small amount of damage that you have to then subtract from your hit points, that slows things down too.
Mm-hmm.
One of the benefits is that when glancing blows were potentially an idea, you may notice that like some of the monsters, especially at low levels, but it continues even after that, but like the level -1 monsters have a pretty intense attack bonus in the Game Mastery Guide, like suggestions for their attack bonus. And that the reason for that is that with glancing blows, if you get surrounded by 8 kobolds and they have a terrible attack bonus and they each do like 1 or 2 damage, they actually could eventually take you down. But once they couldn't, it meant that -1s needed to have a pretty hefty attack bonus so that they wouldn't be like useless to use beyond level 1 and even questionable at level 1, because you want them to be a useful monster. It's even part of what required a difference between -1 and 0, rather than just having a 0 monster. That wasn't entirely, but is that basically it's also an issue that for feel when you're fighting a boss with your PC, because you're going to miss a lot. With glancing blows, you at least could have chipped them away. There's also some interesting ideas with glancing blows about durability for the classes. So it could have been possible to make it so that everybody kind of had more hit points, or like closer hit points to each other, but that certain martial classes had ways to deal with glancing blows. So let's give some examples. Like none of this actually exists, but we're doing what if. So in what if, the barbarian, when they're in rage, maybe they have resistance to glancing blows equal to a certain amount, and they just like they wade in, and yeah, their AC isn't that great. Most enemies will get a glancing blow if they don't hit, but they just shrug them off because of their resistance to glancing blows. You don't even need to have that much of resistance to glancing blows if it's half minimum damage to resist the whole thing, or almost all of it. Right?
Particularly against the weaker foes.
Yep. So with a shield blocking champion or fighter might have an ability that gives them bonus shield blocks they can only use to block glancing blows. Obviously, they would block all of the glancing blow, except for in very extreme circumstances.
And folks are, Rex is saying that, like, people are talking about how high the static damage is, and what effect that would have on how much damage things up.
High static damage might be reduced because of the fact that you're adding some damage on a miss. And it's easy to miss damage on a miss. Like, alchemists have it. And it means that at certain levels, people who have done, like, the spreadsheets have been like, oh, like, at this particular level, I don't remember what it was. It might have been, like, 12. It's like, wow, actually, at this level, like, the bomber alchemist that they built did more expected damage than the archer fighter because of the damage on the misses when calculated out with their spreadsheet. And it's easy to forget those. I think it may have been a little easier to remember them if it always happened. And people are talking about whether glancing blows should increase dying, and you could say that they don't because they're just glancing. They're not enough to actually kill you. That you have to actually hit, maybe, but your AC is so low that you probably would actually hit. And then, so with glancing blows, and where marshals have different special ways to get rid of the glancing blows, it gives an interesting way for caster characters to be a bit more fragile on the front line if they don't sort of multi-class and to gain those martial abilities without having necessarily much lower hit points. Because in the few test that we did with this, like when the caster gets mobbed by weak enemies, even if the enemies mostly miss, they will eventually get the caster into a dangerous situation with glancing blows. It makes the third attack also slightly better for PCs against bosses who may not have a way to deal with glancing blows without making it too wild of an option for like a swarm of minions against your actual frontliner. That could be considered a bad thing because there are benefits to not always attacking and to mixing up your actions. It didn't really make the third attack great against bosses or other enemies though, so it made it a little bit more of a possibility, and it opened up that option if like the enemy was at very low hit points and you're just like, I just need to do a little bit of damage, but my third attack's probably gonna miss. You can still get some of that with abilities like Certain Strike for the fighter, for sure. Yeah, that's kind of glancing blows. You can see how it's a design space where you could be like, oh yeah, maybe like a monk could like deflect it with their fist or something like that. There weren't really that many ideas about what it would do. It also, like the everything is feats, never made it past the core 4. It was just a very early thought. And so with glancing blows, you might have been able to chip things down, and it actually makes being swarmed by minions kind of an interesting situation if you don't have ways to deal with it, and it helps you against bosses if the RNG is really against you.
And there's a mention of like heavier armor might also impact that.
Yes.
And
definitely.
wasn't there some interaction with shields as well?
Yeah, well, I was talking about getting multiple blocks.
Yeah, right, multiple blocks, yes.
And armor specialization effects would certainly help against glancing blows. And Philip, that's exactly what I said at the very beginning. It would make combat take longer to resolve. That's kind of the kiss of death on it, right? Is that it's significantly, even if it's easy enough to calculate 4 degrees of success because people get to that, just taking the hit points off each time actually is a significant expenditure of time, and if you're doing it for like 2 damage, like 6 times, that's gonna take a while. It absolutely will, and it will slow things down in terms of per round. It might make fights a little bit more, a little bit faster because of the fact that it's adding more ways to deal damage that wouldn't have already existed. Silver Knight says maybe rogues have a way to like dodge glancing blows in particular or something like that. Yeah, for sure. And Dalvin, you're correct. It would be fixed damage, no dice roll. That was part of the idea of why it was half minimum, so you didn't have to roll it, at least. You just say, alright, 2. Obvious, yeah, and Kitsune Warlock, Nimble Dodge would be better, just even from the fact that if the enemy wasn't in a chance to crit you, you're taking off 2 glancing blows, as well. But you could also just say +2 AC and no glancing blows. Yeah, you could do that too. There are a lot of... once you have glancing blows as an option, there are a lot of things you can do with it. And, Rex Liquid, that's right. Especially if you're an orc and you're at 1 hit point, because of the first hit or something like that, and because you did the thing like staying up with 1 hit point, you want to be able to stop the glancing blow. And, yeah, there's a lot you could do with it. There's a lot of cost to it. There's a lot of good reasons it's not in the game for all of these what ifs. But I thought it would be fun to just like think about together each of these possibilities and what. So Myriad Starflurry, when it says surprise glancing blows didn't make it into a variant rule in the GMG, and there were a lot of things that might have been on this what if that did, because I wrote that variant rules chapter, and I tried to take all of the cool ideas that people had during the early portion of the game and put them into that chapter if it was easy to do. But glancing blows is not. you need to completely make a whole ecosystem around them to
Yeah, you need
put
to
them into the game.
features for all sorts of different
If
classes. You would need to retool enemy accuracy and damage and things like that throughout the entire system.
Yeah, if you just throw them in now, it's going to be kind of a disaster in certain ways because the low-level monsters still have the extra accuracy, and they would get cleansing blows. The marshals don't have those things I was talking about that block cleansing blows, so it would just suddenly up the necessity to take existing options that give small amount of physical resistances, because otherwise you're going to get downed by a lot of cleansing blows, even if you've got a pretty good AC. So I think it would make it too lethal if you just threw it in, and so it didn't make it into a variant rule. Also, there were no categories of variant rules that were that we knew we wanted to cover that would be easy to put it in, so it would have required additional page space. So there were a few reasons that it didn't make it in, and that none of these made it in.
It would be like, here's your new chart for things. Change most monsters in the game.
I specifically didn't do a what if about any of the ones that are in the variant rules. Because I could have done a what if about, like, expert, master, and legendary crafting of items being what gives them their accuracy boost or AC boost. But that's in GMG, so we don't need to do a what if.
Accuracy, damage of hit points, accuracy, and damage of monsters, and because you need to compensate for the fact that the players have them, and then it would change a lot of stuff.
So Dalvin, you absolutely could use glancing blows on spells with attack rolls as well. The idea was that it would be on pretty much on things with attack rolls would have glancing blows. So that way you were going to at least do half minimum damage on a failure. It's certainly not as good as doing half of regular damage. It's way worse. And recalling also that weapon specialization at that time didn't exactly exist, so half minimum was actually pretty low. But it wasn't that low. It was still like 2 at first level most of the time if your stat was 4, and then it would relatively quickly go up to 3, and then like it eventually went up to maybe like 6. And for spells, it would have been higher because they have more dice.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's basically what we've got in terms of these 5 what if scenarios. Thanks for joining us on Arcane Mark What If. Let's say goodbye to YouTube, and then we'll do our outro with everybody who's still here. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.